On February 9, 2022, the Baptist Joint Committee for Religious Liberty and the Freedom from Religion Foundation released a detailed report titled Christian Nationalism and the January 6, 2021 Insurrection. The report argues that Christian nationalism, the ideology that America is a divinely ordained Christian nation, was not a marginal background influence, but a key lens through which many participants viewed the events. Across dozens of pages, the authors document how religious imagery, prayers, scripture quotations, and symbolic crosses and flags were woven into the insurrection, not just on January 6th, but in the rallies, planning, and discourse leading up to it. One chapter by constitutional lawyer Andrew Seidel traces dry runs after Election Day, showing how Christian nationalist rhetoric served as a permission structure, giving moral sanction and motivation to the violent overthrow. The report concludes by urging religious and secular leaders alike to push back, insisting that Christian nationalism distorts both faith and democracy, and that protecting religious liberty for all requires separating religious authority from political power. Welcome to Gilead, a nation reborn in purity and order. Every role is divinely appointed, every act measured by sacred law, every life dedicated to the greater glory of God's plan. The streets are quiet, banners hang solemnly, and the eyes of the guardians ensure obedience and peace. In Gilead, freedom is redefined as duty, individuality as sacrifice, and love as service to the state. Step forward with humility, lower your gaze, and take comfort in knowing you are exactly where Providence has chosen you to be. The Magdalene laundries were institutions primarily run by Catholic orders in Ireland, where women classified as fallen, including unwed mothers, victims of assault, or those simply considered promiscuous, were confined and forced to work, often in silence and without pay. The laundries operated from the 18th century into the late 20th century, with the last one closing in 1996. Many women were held against their will, their identities erased, and their children taken from them, all under the guise of moral rehabilitation. The laundries became symbols of systemic abuse, shame, and the weaponization of religion against vulnerable women. Survivors have since come forward demanding acknowledgement and reparations for the years of exploitation and psychological trauma. Today, the Magdalene laundries stand as a haunting reminder of how institutional power can disguise cruelty as virtue. In October 2012, Savita Halappanavar was admitted to a hospital in Galway, Ireland. She was 31, 17 weeks pregnant, and miscarrying. She begged the doctors to end the pregnancy. She was in agony, her body failing, the fetus unviable. But Ireland's law forbade abortion. The doctors refused. They told her husband, "This is a Catholic country." Savita died of sepsis, not because there was no treatment, but because faith had been written into law, because morality had been legislated into medicine, because the state decided that her suffering was sacred. Her death sparked outrage across Ireland, fueling the campaign that ultimately legalized abortion there in 2018. Change came, but only after tragedy. It never begins with chaos. It begins with correction. It begins with the promise that the world can be great again, pure again, that the world can be safe again. With the conviction that submission will bring safety, and if you want peace, all you need to do is obey. Before Gilead was born, its language already existed, spoken from pulpits, printed on bumper stickers, taught in classrooms where fear of a changing world became faith in the old ways. But revolutions rarely announce themselves as such. When the moment came, it came quickly. The sons of Jacob stormed the Capitol, killed the president and the Congress in a mass shooting, and then silence. The news said Islamic extremists had been responsible for the attack. Within days, the Constitution was suspended, and the new order was already drafting decrees. When the change came for the civilians, it did not arrive with bombs or fire, or with the sound of boots. It came with paperwork, with quiet votes, revised statutes, and polite denials. Bank accounts were frozen. IDs were invalidated. Rights were suspended for the public good. And then came the slogans. Blessed be the fruit under his eye. Words that sounded like scripture but functioned like speech checks. Gilead rules by terror. The aunts call it education. The commanders call it order. The eyes call it faith. But it's terror all the same. Women are reclassified as property, their bodies nationalized in the name of God. The public hangings are not performances of justice. They are meant to be sermons. The wall is scripture, written in blood and bodies. The ceremony is a ritual of state-sanctioned rape disguised as worship. Gilead doesn't rule by belief, it rules by fear and then calls that fear holiness. Women are divided by function. Handmaids for fertility, wives for purity, Marthas for labor, aunts for indoctrination. Every color-coded uniform signals utility, not identity. But this categorization isn't limited to gender. It's a blueprint for erasure. Those deemed children of Ham are relocated to colonies under the guise of resettlement, a sanitized word for racial exile. Those who do not fit, the sterile, the defiant, the queer, are labeled unwomen. Homosexuals are called gender traitors, and they hang on the wall, their deaths being framed as moral hygiene. Trans people are deleted from the record altogether. In Gilead's lexicon, there is no language for them, and therefore no life. That's how purity works. It doesn't create, it subtracts. It trims the world until only the obedient remain. And yet Gilead feels familiar. Its architecture of control resembles our own institutions. Churches that police desire, states that legislate bodies, cultures that sanctify silence. The difference is in degree, not design. Margaret Atwood once said she invented nothing, she only rearranged the truth. Every cruelty in Gilead has a precedent. What makes it terrifying is not its fiction, but its plausibility. Gilead, like every empire before it, begins with nostalgia, a longing for an imagined past, a return to when families were whole, when genders were natural, and the world was simple. But purity is never memory, it's always revision. It erases what doesn't fit, it rewrites what doesn't serve, and it buries what threatens to resurface. Harriet Jacobs was born into slavery in Edenton, North Carolina in 1813, the daughter of Elijah and Delilah Jacobs, a carpenter and a house servant. Yet her earliest memories were not of bondage, but of gentleness. Her parents were permitted a degree of independence, and her first mistress taught her basic literacy. "I was so fondly shielded," she later wrote, "that I never dreamed I was a piece of merchandise." Harriet and her brother John lived what seemed a normal childhood, until their mother's death shattered the illusion. Only then did Harriet begin to understand the contradictions of her world. She writes, "My mistress had promised my dying mother that her children should be free, and when she died, she left me a slave." With that, the illusion of safety collapsed. The lesson of faith and neighborly love she had been taught no longer applied to her. After her mistress's death, Harriet was willed to the 5-year-old daughter of Dr. James Norcom, a physician who soon took possession of her life. Under his ownership, Harriet entered a new kind of captivity, one marked not only by forced labor, but by pursuit. From adolescence onward, she endured years of Norcom's relentless sexual harassment, threats, and psychological control. In a world where her body was legally another man's property, her resistance could only take the form of silence, strategy, and survival. To escape him, she hid, not in the north, not across an ocean, but in an attic. For 7 years, she lived in a crawl space barely big enough to sit upright, watching her children play through a tiny hole in the wall. Outside, she was believed gone. Inside, she listened to the world move on without her. She wrote that the continued confinement seemed to bewilder my mind, yet she clung to that suffering as her only form of control. When she finally escaped to the north, she found the bondage wore new faces there. She worked as a nursemaid for white families and wrote her story in secret, publishing incidents in the life of a slave girl in 1861 under the name Linda Bread. In its pages, she refused to sanctify her suffering or frame her endurance as exceptional. "I do not state my life as a spectacle of suffering," she wrote, "but as a means of helping others." Jacobs' narrative was revolutionary because it exposed a truth polite society refused to see: that the institution of slavery depended on the control of women's bodies. Long before Gilead, the American South had already built up its own theology of ownership, one where rape was protected by law and motherhood commodified for profit. Harriet's attic became at once her escape and her jail. She carried the story she would one day tell, and her defiance was echoed in the Handmaid's Tale centuries later. Harriet Jacobs lived beneath the system. Serena Joy lived inside it. Both understood what it meant to survive within a world ruled by men, but only one learned compassion from that knowledge. In The Handmaid's Tale, Serena Joy presents herself as the architect of Gilead's domestic order. Once a televangelist who preached virtues of feminine submission, she now reaps the bitter harvest of her own doctrine. Confined to her husband's house, infertile, silenced, and dressed in the color of mourning. She is a woman rewarded with proximity to power, not power itself. A mistress in a nation that has made mistresshood meaningless. In Incidents in the Life of a Slave Girl, Harriet Jacobs met her own Serena Joy. Her mistress after childhood, Dr. Norcom's wife, knew of her husband's abuse, yet turned her jealousy against Harriet instead of the man who caused it. When Mrs. Flint pulled Harriet aside to question her about the doctor's behavior, Harriet was terrified. There was no safe answer. In a world where every truth could be punished, she told the truth as plainly as she could, knowing even honesty might condemn her. The mistress wept, but not for Harriet. Her tears were for her own humiliation, for the reflection of powerlessness Harriet's honesty forced her to confront. Afterwards, Harriet writes, "It would have been more pleasant to me if she had been able to sympathize with me in my trials. But even that boon was denied me. Even in that moment of fear, she longed for empathy and was met instead with jealousy." Like Serena Joy, Mrs. Flint mistook complicity for control. Both women were taught that their virtue depended not on freedom, but on possession, of property, of servants, of purity itself. Each channels her own pain downward, enforcing the system that diminishes her. When Serena forces Offred into the ceremony, she participates in her own degradation, rehearsing the violence that also cages her. Mrs. Flint's cruelty performs the same ritual, sanctifying her suffering by transferring it onto someone else. Jacobs saw this dynamic clearly more than a century earlier. She described white mistresses who vented their rage upon the slave women because it was safer than confronting their husbands. Gilead's wives do the same. Both societies train women to police one another, to see power as something that must be rationed between them, rather than seized from the men who withhold it. Offred's relationship with Nick begins as an attempt to salvage a reproductive strategy that is doomed to fail, but it quickly becomes one of the only spaces where she can reclaim fragments of her humanity. After realizing the commander is likely infertile, Serena Joy coerces Offred into sleeping with Nick, continuing Gilead's reproductive agenda. Yet after the first encounter, Offred continues to return to Nick, not solely out of tactical necessity, but for the emotional intimacy and warmth Gilead has stripped from her life. In a world where every part of her identity has been eroded, her clandestine meetings with Nick become acts of rebellion. Pregnancy remains a part of the calculation. It will grant her temporary safety and value, but Offred's motivations are a combination of survival and longing. Denied the right to marry the free black man she loved, and facing Dr. Flint's escalating plan to isolate her in a private cabin, Harriet Jacobs enters a relationship with Mr. Sands in an attempt to get pregnant and force Flint's hand. By choosing someone of higher social standing who might protect her future children, Harriet attempts to seize what little agency slavery allows. Her hope is calculated, that Flint will be enraged enough by her pregnancy with another white man to sell her and her children together, transferring them to Mr. Sands' possession and away from Flint's control. Harriet's choice is a strategic act born from a world where ownership overrides every personal desire. Yet even as this decision reflects her most realistic path to survival, Harriet is overwhelmed by a deep sense of shame shaped by the Christian values she was taught. She writes that her choice brought her painful emotions and bitter tears, blaming herself for what she saw as a departure from moral purity expected of women. The struggle shows the psychological violence of the system. It not only stripped her of her bodily autonomy, but burdened her with the guilt for choices forced upon her. When The Handmaid's Tale was first published in 1985, its feminism reflected the anxieties of its moment: reproductive rights under threat, the rise of religious conservatism, and the lingering chill of the Cold War. Atwood's warning was sharp, but it was framed through a largely white Western lens. The novel's near absence of race and its depiction of a homogenized Gilead later drew criticism for what many called white feminism, a feminism that centers the oppression of white women while overlooking the histories of black, indigenous, and immigrant women who had already lived under systems like Gilead. These critiques grew louder in the 2010s as readers revisited Atwood's dystopia alongside the writings of women such as Harriet Jacobs, Sojourner Truth, and Margaret Garner, whose lived realities had already contained the violence Atwood imagined. Acknowledging that tension doesn't necessarily weaken The Handmaid's Tale. It reminds us that Gilead is not the first iteration of control over women's bodies, nor is Atwood its first chronicler. Our novel belongs to a continuum of testimony that women of color began long before 1985, and continue to write, remember, and resist today. The conclusion of The Handmaid's Tale resists closure. The handmaid's fate remains unresolved, shifting the text from lived testimony to historical artifact. In the epilogue, the narrative becomes a document for academic scrutiny, more inquiry than survival. Urgency gives way to observation. Classification replaces compassion. Subsequent discoveries, most notably the Testaments, expand our view of Gileadian society. Compiled centuries after the Alfred manuscripts, they corroborate the structures and mythologies first glimpsed in her account. They reintroduce individual subjectivity into a narrative once confined to archival interpretation, revealing how history fractures when mediated through competing records. The later television adaptation, a 21st century artifact of its own, continues this process of cultural excavation. It abandons the academic framing of the historical notes, but performs a similar function, transforming scholarship into spectacle, translating text into image. Across these forms, manuscript, sequel, adaptation, Gilead survives not as a geography, but as discourse, its endurance secured through continual reinterpretation. Yet beneath that structure, the stories remain. Harriet Jacobs' attic and Alfred's room belong to two different centuries, but share the same dimensions of silence, a space where language must whisper itself into record. Both women wrote so that evidence could outlast them, trusting that someone, somewhere, might read beyond the analysis. With this we conclude our study of The Handmaid's Tale. In 1970, a 22-year-old woman from Texas named Norma McCorvey wanted to end a pregnancy she couldn't afford to carry. Under the pseudonym Jane Roe, she joined a lawsuit against Henry Wade, the district attorney of Dallas County. That case became Roe v. Wade. 3 years later, in 1973, the Supreme Court ruled that the Constitution protected a woman's right to choose. The decision meant that control over pregnancy belonged to the person living it. Not to the government, not the church, not anyone else. Before that ruling, abortion was illegal in most states. Women who needed them turned to whoever was willing to help. Sometimes trained doctors working in secret, sometimes people with no medical background at all. Procedures were done in kitchens, motel rooms, and back alleys. Thousands were injured or died from infections and bleeding. Hospitals had entire wards for women who had nearly died from illegal abortions. It wasn't morality that saved them. It was the right to safety. When the court overturned Roe v. Wade in 2022, that right was fragmented again. Some states moved quickly to ban abortion, almost entirely. Others protected it. In many of those restrictive states, doctors who perform abortions can be arrested, stripped of their license, or fined for providing care that was once legal. Clinics have closed. Fear replaces access. A person's ability to make decisions about their own body now depends on geography. The burden of that loss is not shared equally. Studies show that Black and Indigenous women and low-income people across racial lines are the most affected by abortion bans. They are more likely to live in states with the harshest restrictions, more likely to face barriers to contraception and parental care, and more likely to die from pregnancy-related causes. For them, reproductive freedom is not an abstract debate, but a question of survival. To legislate that away is to decide whose lives are worth protecting. The erosion of bodily autonomy does not end with reproductive rights. Across the country, trans people are facing a wave of legislation that seeks to control their medical decisions, their identities, and even their visibility in public life. Dozens of states have moved to ban gender-affirming care, restrict bathroom access, and criminalize doctors who provide treatment supported by every major medical association. These laws, like abortion bans, are built on the same premise, that the state has the right to decide what a person can do with their own body. The cost is measured not only in freedom, but in lives, as trans youth face higher risks of depression, self-harm, and suicide when denied care. The struggle for autonomy is shared. The right to exist as oneself, to seek safety and dignity, belongs to everyone. This is why participation matters. As exhausting as it is to track legislation, to vote in every local election, to call representatives who may not listen, it remains necessary. Rights are not self-maintaining. They erode in the silence between election cycles. Staying politically active is tedious, imperfect, and often discouraging. But the alternative is surrendering those choices to people who will decide for you.